We're now going to begin talking about middle childhood. This is going to be from ages approximately 7 to 11. Approximately the time that children have now been in school for a couple of years now, beginning with preschool and kindergarten, and are really starting to get into the habit of being in a school environment. So we'll talk about the body and mind first. This is generally a pretty healthy time in the sense that there are a lot of childhood illnesses that afflict children younger than age 7, and there are a lot of deaths and accidents that are caused in adolescence and older years that are not as common in this middle childhood period. So this is considered to be a relatively healthy time in that sense. The average 7 to 11-year-old gains about 2 inches and 5 pounds per year. Healthy 7-year-olds, they tend to be agile and neither too thin nor too heavy. After age 6, the rate of muscle growth starts to slow a little bit because of the degree to which it was rapidly expanding in the previous childhood years. And children begin to master many of the motor skills that don't require adult-sized bodies. In other words, their motor skills have become highly capable, and sometimes they're only limited by their physical bodies themselves, not by their ability to control those bodies. Of course, there are a number of problems that also still do develop in middle childhood, asthma being one of the more common ones. About 10% of middle childhood children are affected by asthma. This is a chronic disease of the respiratory system in which inflammation narrows the airways from the nose and mouth to the lungs, causing difficulty in breathing. So signs and symptoms associated with this difficulty breathing include things like wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness, and coughing. And you can imagine that given that this is a very active time for children, this could be quite a limitation on their ability to enjoy this time of life, given the limitations that they might have from difficulty breathing. Of course, there are some treatments that make it possible for children to live a relatively normal life. In terms of the cause of asthma, some experts have suggested a hygiene hypothesis for the current increase in all allergies, from peanuts, for instance. This is an allergen that affects about 1% of children, to cockroach droppings, which is a potential trigger for asthma. In other words, sometimes we're exposed to things at a very young age that make us susceptible to developing asthma later on, and alternatively, sometimes we are not exposed to potential things that if we were exposed to in our earlier years, we would have developed more of an immunity to them. And if we haven't developed that immunity, like once again, we become susceptible to developing illnesses to those things later on as well. Obesity, this is obviously becoming more and more of a concern for the entire world, and in particular the United States. Many 7 to 11-year-olds eat too much, exercise too little, and become overweight or obese as a result. The typical way to try to standardize, what constitutes a child being overweight, is there a certain weight limit that indicates that a child is overweight, or a body fat percentage? Well, it's usually getting body fat percentages is not quite as easy as calculating this body mass index here. This is just the ratio of weight to height, calculated by dividing a person's body weight in kilograms by the square of his or her height in meters. So it's a quick and dirty way to assess whether somebody weighs too much for their particular height. Now, of course, the only thing you're taking into consideration here is height and weight. So there could be a lot of other factors, but generally speaking, for children, this is going to be a relatively good indicator. Not quite as good for adults because of varying degrees of muscle mass and things like that. But for children, it tends to be a pretty good, quick and easy measurement. So overweight, in adults at least, is defined as having a body mass index of 25 to 29. So again, you could calculate your own body mass index very easily using this formula here. In a child, having a BMI above the 85th percentile, according to the US CDC, the Center for Disease Control, their 1980 standards set the percentile for being overweight. 85th percentile means that you're heavier than, or you have a higher BMI than 85% of other children. In other words, that's what that means. So that's the top 15%. Obesity in an adult is defined as having a BMI of 30 or more, and in the children, it's having a BMI above the 95th percentile. So in other words, having a BMI that's greater than 95% of other children the same age. And you can see in this graph here that in 1960, the prevalence of overweight children was only about 5%. In 1970, still just under 5%. Really, after 1970, we see a dramatic increase, and this ends at 2004 here. But this is a very scary trend. I mean, almost 20% of children ages 6 to 11 are overweight, and given that it's usually not children for the most part determining what they eat. Of course, at school that might be somewhat of a different story, but parents have a large role in determining what their children eat. And of course, that's not the only factor. There's also the exercise, which parents could have a say in as well, but ultimately that will be both part of the child's and the adult's, the parent's decision about both exercise and eating. So it's important to institute early habits that are going to prevent this. So again, physical activity is going to be one of the things that's certainly going to be likely to reduce a child's BMI, and it comes with many benefits. It comes with better overall health, including less asthma, of course, less obesity, appreciation of cooperation and fair play, because typically when we're physically active, we're playing games, playing sports, things like that, in which you're developing those social skills and learning the rules of how to play appropriately. Also improved problem-solving ability and respect for teammates and opponents of many ethnicities and nationalities. There are some hazards, of course, that come along with physical activity, and these things tended to be less so the case with early childhood. In particular, a loss of self-esteem because of critical teammates or coaches. Usually, this is a time in children's lives when they start to get a little bit more realistic feedback about how they're doing. And so there's the potential that if they're not doing well, or if they're being overly criticized, there's the potential for an adverse impact on self-esteem there. Injuries, of course, the famous Little League elbow is one example. So there's some people that say that children really shouldn't be pitching. This is primarily for pitchers, of course, who are throwing quite a bit. But the growing bones and ligaments and tendons and things like that means that there's an increased opportunity for damage there. Also prejudice, especially against the other sex. So this is a time when children might start to experience the you can't do this because you're a boy, or you can't do that because you're a girl type of thing. So that's a potentially adverse type of thing, and all of these things could have the result of increasing stress, as evidenced by altered hormone levels and potentially even some sleep disruption or insomnia. Theories about cognition, we've talked about Piaget before. We started off talking about his sensory motor domain of development, and then the pre-operational, and now in middle childhood we have the concrete operational thought. Or concrete operational stage. So this was Piaget's term for the ability to reason logically about direct experiences and perceptions. Again, reason logically. That was something that was not present previously, but it's still to some extent limited to direct experiences and perceptions. So really, it's this latter statement here, the direct experiences and perceptions, that's going to differentiate concrete operational thought in middle childhood from formal operational thought, which adults are more likely to utilize. Classification. This is the logical principle that things can be organized into groups or categories or classes according to some characteristic that they have in common. So, how do we determine what species a particular organism fits into? Well, that's a classification process, and that's something that children are beginning to become more aware of how to do themselves, is how to classify things. And ultimately, this is a manner of thinking in which we really have to think about, well, what makes these two things similar? Because if I'm going to place them into the same category, I have to identify some similarity that they have between one another. And it could be just that a fruit or an apple and a banana are both pieces of fruit, or it could be something a little bit more complex, like a microwave and a toaster oven are both kitchen appliances. That would be a little bit more abstract way of thinking about it, but they're both forms of classification, finding that thing that makes them similar in some way. You also start to see transitive inference. This is the ability to figure out or infer. That's the inference and that's the infer and inference there. The unspoken link between one fact and another. So again, this goes back to the idea of being able to use logical reasoning. So an example might be if Tom is taller than Ron and Ron is taller than Bill, then we can logically infer that Tom is taller than Bill as well. Even though there's no direct comparison there, we can use logic to infer that this must be the case. We also start to see seriation. This is the idea that things can be arranged in a series, and this is crucial for understanding the number sequence. So, for instance, being able to estimate, if there are 100 jelly beans in this jar here, and you can see, approximately, it's a glass jar, you can see about how many different colors there are. Children now begin to be able to better estimate, the proportion that of one color relative to another color. And contemporary developmentalists, they find that in some ways Piaget was mistaken in the sense that, of course, there's no sudden shift between pre-operational and concrete operational thought. Although, there's certainly plenty of evidence to suggest that these are somewhat distinct ways of thinking. It's just that there's no sudden transition moving from one end to the other. It's much more gradual than Piaget had thought. And that's really the main criticism that we see about his theories at all points in the lifespan, is that the stages are much less stage-like and much more continuous than Piaget had believed. And so what develops during middle childhood is the ability to use mental categories and subcategories flexibly, in other words, to be able to change them, inductively, in other words, to make inferences about things, and simultaneously, so to think about more than one thing at the same time. Vygotsky, so whereas in terms of Vygotsky's theory, Piaget emphasized the child's discovery, Vygotsky regarded instruction as essential. So keep in mind that Vygotsky, his main contribution was the idea of this zone of proximal development in which children are guided through things in order to achieve things that they couldn't do on their own, but they can do with a little bit of assistance. So he often referred to children as apprentices in learning. As they play with each other, watch television, eat dinner with their families, and engage in other interactions, they're continuously learning from those who are able to do things more easily and those who are more cognitively advanced. And language here is the integral mediator. This is the vehicle for understanding and for learning. So children will often take things that other people say and sort of use that language, use that thought that they hear, and sort of take it into their own repertoire. So it's not just the same thing as I could give you an example of in early childhood, a child might just repeat something that they've heard previously. Whereas in middle childhood, that child who hears something that they've never heard before would be much more likely to take that and then use what they just heard to try to understand a little bit more about what it means based on that particular situation. And then they might then use that phrase in a novel situation to refer to the same thing. Information processing theory is a perspective, once again, we've talked about this before, that compares the human thinking processes by analogy to computer analysis of data, including sensory input, connections, stored memories, and output. And so in middle childhood, we see an increase in selective attention. That's the ability to concentrate on some stimuli while ignoring others. So you can really think about selective attention as very similar to the concept of concentration. I can, continue to read this book while I hear other people around me talking. That's the ability to focus on one thing while ignoring the other things that are irrelevant going on around me. Things become much more automatized. Automatization is a process in which repetition of a sequence of thoughts and actions makes the sequence routine so that it no longer requires conscious thought. The more we do things, the easier they become, and also the less we need to think about them. So, we don't need to think about how to tie our shoes after we've done it enough times. Likewise, we don't need to think about how to make our breakfast when we've made it a certain number of times. Reaction time also increases. The reaction time is the time it takes to respond to a stimulus, either physically, such as reflexive movement like an eye blink, or cognitively, such as a thought. So how long does it take you to answer the question, what's 2 plus 2? That would be, example of this, the cognitive reaction time. Sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory also change. Sensory memory, not too much. This is a component of the information processing system in which incoming stimulus is stored for a split second to allow it to be processed. It's also called the sensory register because it's really just a very, very brief, most people don't even consider it to be a memory. It is a part of memory in a sense, but it doesn't seem like it because it's just so brief. It's your ability to listen to my voice and maintain what I've just said for just a split second in order to determine whether you're going to actually pay attention to it. So, like I said, if you were listening to this lecture right now and somebody was talking in the background, you might have the ability to selectively attend to what I'm saying to the exclusion of what that other conversation is about. But if somebody had said your name in that conversation, even though you're trying to pay attention to what I'm saying right now, it would probably catch your attention most likely. And the reason why it's able to do this, even though you're focusing on what I'm saying, that your name, when you heard it from the other conversation, would be stored in your sensory memory very briefly, and that brief period of time would allow you to selectively attend to that as opposed to selectively attending to me. So that's what sensory memory is. It's very short, and it doesn't really change dramatically in middle childhood, but working memory and long-term memory certainly do. Working memory is the component of the information processing system in which conscious mental activity occurs. It's by some people referred to also as short-term memory, although short-term memory is slightly different. Short-term memory is the ability to hold information in your mind without doing anything with it. So, for instance, if I just read you a series of numbers, 6, 1, 8, 3, 9, 2, your ability to remember those numbers for a brief period of time would be short-term memory. If I said, I'm going to say a series of numbers and then I want you to say them back to me in the reverse order, not only would you have to remember those numbers, which is your short-term memory, but you'd have to mentally reverse them, put them in the reverse order. So if I said the numbers 7 first, that would be the last number that you would have to say, and that would be an example of working memory. And that's the type of thing that um, that advances in middle childhood. And a lot of that advancement most likely stems from the increase in frontal lobe development. Long-term memory. The reason that this is the component of information processing in which virtually limitless amounts of information can be stored indefinitely. So just to clarify what we mean when we say short-term and long-term memory, short-term memory is what I just said. How, you know, your ability to remember those 6 digits that I just said a moment ago for a very brief period of time. They're probably gone right now. If you have not committed those numbers to long-term memory, they are gone from your short-term memory. Okay, that's short-term memory. Long-term memory is anything that lasts beyond about 30 seconds. So if you can still remember those numbers, the reason you can remember them is because they're in your long-term memory. And the reason that long-term memory changes and improves so much throughout childhood is in part due to brain development, neural development in the pathways that memory takes to be stored, but also because of the strategies that they use. And what I mean by that is, we can use certain strategies to remember different things. So I'm notoriously bad at remembering people's names, but every once in a while, I'll think to myself, okay, how can I remember this person's name? And then, I might take something about the name and say, this person's name is Bill, and I might think of receiving a bill in the mail that maybe somebody had given me, and then I make this association between a bill in the form of a requirement of payment and this individual here that I've just associated with a bill in the mail, and so it's the ability to make these associations that just make it more likely that I'm going to remember that this person's name is Bill. So working memory improves steadily and significantly every year from 4 to 15 years, as we just said. The capacity of long-term memory is virtually limitless by the end of middle childhood. So even though you're not in middle childhood, you can still probably remember a number of probably important events that may have occurred in middle childhood for you. Memory storage, this is how much information is deposited in the brain. This expands over childhood, but more important is retrieval. How readily stored information can be brought back into working memory. And as I said, as the prefrontal cortex matures, children are better able to use strategies to help them remember. And retrieval will also become more efficient and accurate because retrieval is very closely associated with the way that we store information in the first place. There's also changes in metacognition. We've talked about metacognition before. This is thinking about thinking, or the ability to evaluate a cognitive task in order to determine how best to accomplish it, and then monitor and adjust one's performance on that task. So again, this is your awareness of how your thinking is going, or your awareness of how you're doing on some task. So, as a student, you would always want to be aware of how am I doing in a particular course, because it's unfortunately not all that uncommon for a student to stay in a class until the last week, and they're failing, and they want to know, is there any way that I can pass this class? And at the end of the semester, it might be completely impossible. And probably would have been a wiser decision to have been monitoring. So if I'm not doing how I'd like to be doing in a course halfway through the semester, unless I do something drastically to change my performance, I'm probably going to do pretty similarly for the second half of the semester. And this is what metacognition is all about. It's about thinking about our own performances and abilities and thoughts and performance. Metamemory is a form of metacognition. This is the ability to understand how memory works in order to use it well. And this is an essential element of metacognition, of course. Okay, let's talk a little bit about learning in school. Okay, obviously the purpose of school is primarily for learning, and it's not just learning as in the standard curriculum of math, reading, science, and whatnot, but also in terms of all the other experiences that come along with being in a school environment. And teaching values, to some extent, do differ from school to school, of course. In some nations, every public school teaches religion, whereas in the United States, most children who attend private school, about 10%, or who are homeschooled, learn specific religious content. So, and of course, in public schools, in most places, that's forbidden in the United States. Among other specifics taught in some schools are evolution and sex education, both ideas that Americans want children to learn, although some parents do not want their children to learn about evolution. And there's also the idea that there's a hidden curriculum. This is the unofficial, unstated, and implicit rules and priorities that influence the academic curriculum and every other aspect of learning in a school. So this includes things like school environment and who the teachers are, and the things that are conveyed to students, not directly but implicitly. So implicitly really means that there's I could say something, and I could say it sarcastically, in which case what I actually said doesn't match the meaning behind it. So there's the meaning is kind of somewhat implicit in what I've said, in that it's not just what you're seeing, but it's the underlying meaning behind what you're seeing, sort of thing. That's what the hidden curriculum refers to. Excuse me. By age 6, children know most of their basic vocabulary and grammar of their first language, and many will speak a second and even third language. Some school-age children learn as many as 20 new words a day and begin to apply grammar rules that they did not use before, and are speaking both more fluently as well as more grammatically correctly, usually because of their ability to utilize those grammar rules and understand the different times when they should and should not be using them. So this is directly related to language learning. Directly related to language learning is another capacity of the school-age child. This is the ability to switch from one manner of speaking or language code to another. Each language code differs in tone, pronunciation, gesture, sentence length, idiom, grammar, and vocabulary. So sometimes people switch from a more formal code used in academic contexts to the informal code, often used with friends. So you wouldn't talk to your college professor the same way that you might talk to your friends. And many children, of course, and adults too, really, use a third code in text messaging with numbers, abbreviations, and emoticons that I'm sure we're all familiar with. There are some debates about the best way to go about learning for children who are either bilingual or are not speakers of the predominant language. And one of the main questions is, should immigrant children be required to speak only standard English in school right from the beginning, or should they be educated in their native language in the early grades? And of course, you could see advantages to both sides of this argument here. But these English language learners are children who, for them, English is a second language. And in the United States, some school districts offer bilingual education, teaching in 2 languages, whereas others provide English as a second language. And others offer only immersion, which is when children are taught exclusively in a language that is not spoken at home. So that would be typically English. And there are different reasonings behind why one might be better than another, but usually when that's the case, it's usually the combination approach that tends to be the best. And we see that here as well in these things, in this term here, the reading wars. The reading wars refers to a debate about whether the phonics approach or the whole language approach was better. A phonics approach is teaching reading by first teaching the sounds of each letter and of various letter combinations. So, the way that you pronounce the word "and" is to teach a child that A has the A sound, N has the N sound, and D has the D sound, and that when you put them together, that's how you get "and." The whole language learning approach involves teaching reading by encouraging early use of all skills, not just this phoneme to word approach. Language skills like talking and listening, reading and writing are all incorporated in order to teach reading. And both a focus on phonics need not undercut instruction that motivates children to read, write, and discuss their classmates with their classmates and their parents. So, of course, that's a way of saying that both of these approaches have value and should most likely be used in combination with one another. Similarly, we see another debate in these math wars. So historically, math was taught by rote. Children memorized number facts, such as the multiplication tables, and filled page after page of workbooks. And certainly, learning your multiplication tables does have its utility, because there are certain times when it's very useful to be able to multiply 7 times 8, and the way to go about being able to answer that question quickly, as we said before, sort of automatically, is to just have that memorized. In reaction against this approach, however, many educators, especially those inspired by Piaget and Vygotsky, they sought to make math instruction more active and engaging, less a matter of memorization than of discovery, sort of allowing children to discover these things rather than them having them do these exercises over and over and over again to try to instill that automatization that we talked about before. In terms of when we are looking at childhood learning, the typical way to assess learning and assess the factors that are influential in terms of learning is to administer tests in order to try to really essentially measure the mind. When you're giving a test, you're attempting to try to see what is in someone's mind, and so that's what measuring the mind refers to here. And there are different types of tests altogether. Aptitude tests are tests that attempt to measure a person's potential to master a specific skill or to learn a certain body of knowledge. In other words, aptitude tests are not designed to measure what you know, but rather your ability to learn certain things. And IQ tests are typically designed to measure intellectual aptitude or the ability to learn in school. Originally, intelligence was defined as mental age divided by chronological age times 100, hence the term intelligence quotient or IQ, because a quotient is always the result of doing a division. In this case, you're dividing mental age by chronological age. That's not exactly how it's done today, but we'll talk about that a little later. I'll just say for now that it's based on a comparison to other people of a similar age. Achievement tests, in contrast to aptitude tests, these are measures of mastery or proficiency in things that one has already learned. So reading, mathematics, writing, science, or some other subject. In other words, achievement tests you would not be able to do well on unless you had learned information on that specific subject, whereas aptitude tests you could potentially do well on even if you have not been exposed to a great extent to any material in that area. The most important aptitude for school-age children is intellectual aptitude, or the ability to learn in school. And again, this is usually measured by an IQ test, and the most commonly used measure of intelligence is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC for short. This is an IQ test designed for school-age children. It goes from about ages 4 to 17, and the test assesses potential in many areas, including vocabulary, general knowledge, memory, and spatial comprehension. It's not strictly an aptitude test. There are some things that you could not possibly know the answer to unless you had learned them, but it's used as a measure of sort of a combination of aptitude and achievement. The Flynn effect, this refers to a rise in average scores that has occurred over the decades in many nations. In other words, um, although the average average IQ today is higher than it was, say, 20 years ago. In other words, 10-year-olds know more information. They're able uh, to answer more questions on IQ tests than 10-year-olds were able to do 20 years ago. So they're both 10 years old, but the Flynn effect refers to the fact that children today are able to do better on these IQ tests than than 10-year-olds were 20, 40, 60 years ago, etc. So the Flynn effect refers to this rise in average IQ scores. And one of the main ways to diagnose mental retardation is using an intelligence test. Mental retardation, it's actually referred to as intellectual disability now. It refers literally to slow or late thinking. So retarded means held back. So held back mentally, essentially, is what that translates into. In practice, people are considered mentally retarded if they score both below 70 on an IQ test and if they are markedly behind their peers in their ability to meet the basic requirements of daily life. So an IQ test in and of itself is insufficient to make a diagnosis of mental retardation. You need both an IQ test score and some indication of whether that individual is able to meet the basic requirements of daily life that most other individuals their age are capable of. Some attempts to try to ensure the quality of education that children are receiving can be seen in some of the U.S. laws. For instance, the No Child Left Behind Act. This was enacted in 2001, and it was intended to increase the accountability in education by requiring states to qualify for federal education funding by administering standardized tests to measure school achievement. In other words, if children were not scoring at a certain level on these standardized tests, they would get less funding. Because presumably they weren't doing an adequate job of teaching information. The National Assessment of Education Progress is an ongoing and nationally representative measure of U.S. children's achievement in reading, mathematics, and other subjects over time. And it's been nicknamed the nation's report card in order to try to identify trends in U.S. children's achievement performances. We also see some other types of assessments, such as the PEARLS, which is a literacy study. This was inaugurated in 2001. It's a planned 5-year cycle of international trend studies in reading ability of fourth graders, and international meaning that attempts are being made to try to compare different nations to one another for fourth graders, as well as the Trends in Math and Science study. This is an international assessment of the math and science skills of 4th and 8th graders. Although it's very useful, different countries' scores are not always comparable because of things like sample selection, test administration, and content validity. Those are very difficult to keep uniform across different countries, especially if there are different languages being used. But of course, the cultures themselves also have a dramatic impact on performance as well. Also, in terms of measuring the mind, we should talk about developmental psychopathology. This is the field that uses insights into typical development to understand and remediate developmental disorders, and vice versa. Children with special needs are children who, because of a physical or mental disability, require extra help in order to learn. Education of children with special needs is most beneficial when it begins early, and so it's important to try to detect these children as early as possible. And interestingly enough, that was actually the purpose of the development of the IQ test, was to identify children who were not performing as well as others, because the belief was that if they weren't doing as well, they just needed a little bit of extra help to bring them up to speed with the other children. And so that's what the original purpose of the development of IQ tests was. Of course, availability of programs varies within and among nations, and so after identifying who the children are that might need special needs, of course, it's equally important to make sure that they get the resources that can help them. And these are a list of some of the different types of things that are available. An individual education plan is for children with special needs. It specifies any special curricula or services that they must receive. The least restrictive environment. This is the idea that children with special needs, they must be educated in a regular classroom if possible, and that segregated classrooms are a last resort. Even for somebody who might need a little bit of assistance in a classroom, they should still be kept in that classroom, and it's ideal to try to bring someone in to help them rather than to take that child out completely. And mainstreaming is a related concept. It's the concept that all children should learn together in the regular or mainstream classroom, and that teachers are supposed to accommodate special needs. And then you've got inclusion. This is the policy of including children with special needs in the regular classroom. Again, very similar to the least restrictive environment idea. A special educator may provide help within the regular class. Resource room is a room with usually books, teachers, and other materials for children with those special needs. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a law that mandates educational services for children with special needs. Updated every few years, it stressed the need for early education from birth on, with periodic reevaluation and parental access. There are several lessons from developmental psychopathology that can be applied to everyone. And the first is that abnormality is normal. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but most people sometimes act oddly, of course. And those with serious disabilities are in many respects like everyone else. In other words, everyone has a particular pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Somebody might be really good in math, not so good in English, or the complete opposite, really good in English, not so good in math. And so that's not very different from a child who requires special services in one of those particular subjects. And the other thing is that disabilities change year by year. Someone who's seriously disabled at one stage may become quite capable later on, or vice versa, particularly if they get help to try to bring them back up to the level of other children. Adulthood may be better or worse than childhood. Prognosis is often difficult. Many infants and children with serious disabilities that affect them psychologically, for example, blindness, become happy and productive adults. And conversely, some conditions become more disabling at maturity when interpersonal skills become more important. And ultimately, a particular diagnosis depends on the social context. So, according to the DSM-4 TR, the nuances of an individual's cultural frame of reference must be considered before a diagnosis is rendered. That's just a way of saying that we really need to consider the cultural context in which a behavior takes place before we can decide whether it constitutes a problem or an abnormality. So the DSM-4 TR, that's the manual published by the American Psychiatric Association, that's used for diagnosing all mental disorders. And the 5th edition will be coming out in May 2013, next year. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is becoming more and more prevalent in the media, in all the media. There's a lot of research on it, but it's also on the news quite often. It's a condition in which a person is inattentive, impulsive, and overactive. This is great difficulty concentrating for more than a few moments. And again, this disorder is is somewhat elusive in terms of diagnosis. It's not always clear whether something constitutes normal inattentiveness, which it might be completely expected in children who are asked to sit in a chair for 6 hours a day, versus something that represents an abnormality that's in need of treatment. But one thing that we do know is that there's a high rate of what's called comorbidity. This is the presence of two or more unrelated disease conditions at the same time in the same person. And how unrelated exactly the disease conditions are is subject to debate. But for instance, a child who develops ADHD is at an increased risk of being diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder as well. And so the fact that if you have one, you're more likely to develop the other, that's what this idea of comorbidity represents. Learning disabilities, these are marked delays in a particular area of learning that are not caused by an apparent physical disability, by mental retardation, or by an unusually stressful home environment. And one specific type of learning disability is dyslexia. This is an unusual difficulty with reading. It's thought to be a result of some neurological underdevelopment. Of course, it's not all that well understood, but what dyslexia does seem to be is a difficulty in producing the sounds that are associated with the written words, and that's what actually makes it difficult for them to read. But that's what it is. Dyslexia is a difficulty with reading. And then, of course, we also have autism spectrum disorders. These are any of several disorders that are characterized by impaired communication, inadequate social skills, and unusual patterns of play. Autism is really marked by an inability to relate to other people normally, extreme self-absorption, and an inability to acquire normal speech. So there's a lot of evidence or a lot of research in theory of mind and autism. That is, children with autism have a great deal of difficulty with those theory of mind tasks that we talked about earlier that tend to develop between the ages of 2 and 4. And Asperger's syndrome is an autistic spectrum disorder that's characterized by extreme attention to details and deficient social understanding. So they also have difficulties with their socialization, but they don't have the same typical language deficits that are seen in autism.